Invasion Audiobook, Finale Part 2 of 2. Over and off near the middle of the former nation, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was now trouble afoot. Day 4 of the invasion had seen some of the last viciously intense, bloody battles occurring there within the 4-day invasion. There had been 2 days initially of savage strikes of various types amid major armored assaults, along with enormous external elements passing through from Canada, all moving inland to strike deep into the heart of America, thereby to assist all the Trojan shock units already in all corners of the land, seizing much of it already. Within the Ann Arbor AO and other Michigan AOs like Lansing and Detroit, among others, the Trojan units stationed within these areas were tasked with the major responsibility of doing all of the work of securing the proverbial gates into American territory from that area, as neighboring Canada's Ontario funnel was literally right adjacent to Detroit. Therefore, had all of the Trojan units been of a potent mixture of highly combat experienced and brutal PAP shock troops from subordinate brigades of the 2nd Mobile Contingent of the PAP, they themselves had fought a low-level counterinsurgency campaign within the hinterlands of Xinjiang for many years, upon first securing and locking down the cities therein. Also, the mighty PLA group armies, about 4 total to cover the state, as well as some other types of paramilitary forces present as well, primarily of the National Construction Corps, who built Laogai camps nationwide, and rapidly so. And there was also even one corps of Marine militia who operated from the Great Lakes to capture the northernmost Michigan Peninsula and secure it, as it was sparsely populated, and thus was a corps of Marine militia ample enough to secure it, even with their light gunboats, landing rafts, and dinghies, and the lightly armed infantry troops of the Marine militia themselves. All in all, this enormous combined Trojan force of nearly 300,000 just for Michigan State alone was plenty of personnel to do the job and do it effectively, as all as 10 whole group armies passed through Ann Arbor on the way in a southwesterly direction while moving deeper inland from Canada. That, as did more come down to the south and southeast upon leaving Detroit area while moving in from Canada as well. In Ann Arbor, the three brigades holding the AO, including one KPA brigade from the coalition's Foreign Expeditionary Forces, namely being itself comprised of all the smaller allies whose combined contribution numbered about some 500,000 total troops. And these troops were in addition to China's 10 million troops and Russia's 2 million troops, altogether totaling 12.5 million to cover the entire land. Of the other two brigades, which were Savage PAP light armored brigades within the Ann Arbor AO, they themselves, along with the KPA's Mechanized Infantry Brigade, had secured Ann Arbor, defeating its American version of a Tet offensive, and then even launched a major counteroffensive with their own forces, based upon A1 intelligence ascertained via prisoner interrogations. The products of interrogation, along with the intelligence officers and analysts piecing it all together to come up with a highly effective plan to put a halt to the resistance activity within the Ann Arbor AO as a whole. George and the other wounded men back at the original dug-in earthwork campsite, having been north and slightly west of Ann Arbor, the city itself, had thereby been found by a high-flying PLAAF recon drone, having used its potent IR sensors and cameras only to have discovered a fire. This fire, having burned too high from its initially smaller embers, which ordinarily were as high as the partisans would allow their fires for security reasons, being as small as embers, that is. Only then in following to relay that new intel of the discovered fire back to headquarters on the FOB side of the dual-use Laogai FOB installation, all in order to organize an artillery strike to destroy the camp before sending in nearby KPA forces to identify the dead and to clear the area. Indeed, George and the others met a grisly end, gored by the vicious PLA artillery in the distance, and one lone survivor in a further away earthen bunker being wiped out by KPA soldiers, then later clearing the earthen bunkers, still remaining post-shelling by the PLA troops. Beyond that, with Tony and Anders KIA'd by the sniper, who in fact was a PAP sniper, then hiding in the apartment complex they were attempting to pass by at the time, as, of course, snipers, and even such in tandem with mines and or traps, were easily able to hold down fairly large areas of land. Thus had the two men fallen victim to well-placed precision shooting. No mines were in the area at the time, nor were there any traps. But sniper activity could be heart-stopping in the literal and figurative sense. After all, such deaths were so sudden, you never could even see it coming. Jacob, having therefore learned a vital lesson upon the death of his mentor and Anders, was picked up by deeply concerned members of the group they'd before encountered. Some of the Diamond Men, as they were called, perhaps one of its two platoons comprising it, had been leaving the area from their previous ambush conducted upon the KPA platoon of mechanized infantry, and ran into where Tony, Anders, and Jacob had originally headed towards. This while they filed out and away towards a new location themselves for the night. They then found Jacob, snapping him out of his total stupor, who explained what just had happened. In return, of course, the man who yanked Jacob up had informed him of the KPA patrol then inbound, most likely to check on their forces who were just freshly ambushed. But just as likely as well, the sniper who took out Tony and Anders may have also even radioed in Jacob, who just narrowly escaped his own erstwhile seemingly imminent fate. Jacob, who was then literally shaken to his senses, then picked up his weapon and was permitted to travel with the other men who found him having a mental breakdown. Jacob himself, seeing this as an immensely great privilege, having of course witnessed how smoothly and professionally they operated insofar as the Diamond Men were concerned, and how they did things in general. He himself had even wanted to be a part of them and their group due to his personal admiration of how they operated. But he still wasn't. Just because he was traveling along for the time being didn't make him one of them. At least, not yet. No, they were just being in their own minds good Americans, helping another American in dire need. After all, their group's biggest goal was to liberate Americans from Chi-Com slavery within the Laogais, being perhaps the most noble goal any partisan group could set for themselves. While nowhere near strong enough just yet in such terms being to attack bigger, more fortified and populated combat outposts, FOBs, or other types of built-up bases just yet, they'd get there eventually. As the saying went, Rome wasn't built in a day. No soldier picks up a weapon and can automatically take on the world, even if they feel like they can. No, rather, it takes organization, communication, coordination, planning, dedication, discipline, adequate training, and well-supplied members, not to mention the teamwork of said members, all working in concert. If any of the aforementioned are not met, then you've got problems, and potentially even eternal demise for many. That was what was inherently wrong with so many American partisan groups and why many were so easily slaughtered, because they failed to meet such criteria and were often fatally flawed in that regard. Literally and figuratively speaking, in the sense of the words fatally flawed in quotes. Be that as it were, there were still other groups that knew how to get the job done, and realistically so. Meaning, they knew what their own limitations were and why, knowing damn full well what they could do, but also what they could not do in terms of their own capabilities as groups. They weren't yet strong enough to hit anything except for tiny fringe garrisons and outposts or small checkpoints on roads, perhaps. They could hit platoons or smaller sized groupings, and do it well and mostly quietly. This as it pertained to the Diamond Men and other groups like them. But early on, they had to focus first on building up their weapons and supplies in this way, utilizing such means. Hence, they grew stronger and stronger as the time passed. They also sought group members who were largely like they were, with extensive backgrounds and discipline in terms of the military realm. Jacob had the most basic of the basic training, and though he now had some real combat experience from the previous several days of invasion, Jacob lacked professional discipline and really couldn't do it alone in relation to fighting in general terms. He fought well with Tony there to guide him, but now Tony was dead. So it was him against the world, and the partisans of the Diamond Group thereby took pity upon him, seeing him in his breakdown, and helped just yet another American in need in so doing, at least until he could get on his feet again. As they set out, now crouched low, following the drainage ditch where they originally found Jacob laying down within, although outright avoiding as well the field and apartment complex on the other side of the little wood line which concealed them for the time being, they walked in staggered column formation as a group. Jacob took a place within the column, near the middle, with more experienced men watching behind and in front of the staggered column formation now proceeding forward. Each man had an overlapping sector of fire in order to watch one specific portion within the group's 360-degree security within the now mobile formation of men. Jacob snapped out of his mind cluster shit of a near breakdown and temporarily was now refocused on his current efforts along with the group having had rescued him. This time, it was about getting the hell out of the hot zone as opposed to anything else. The men followed the ditch all the way to another ravine. It was short, but it worked. Next, they got in a single column formation from the staggered one to be able to fit within the natural trench-like ravine. It made good cover and decent concealment if it came down to using the prone position or extremely low crouching at about almost 4 feet in height with some variations in the terrain. As they all made their way, silently now, with only hand signals, they'd passed many corpses of fallen Americans. Some had weapons in hand or off to the side near them. Others did not. These, having had been recently killed in actions, as all the others from earlier were stacked in piles by this point, many already having been burnt up by PAP or KPA flamethrowers as a means of body disposal. Others were hung in trees by the PAP and left there for birds to feed on. Others had been impaled by stakes and used as actual road signs to both warn partisans that the PAP was in the area and had struck there, and also with Mandarin signage hung around the necks of the impaled, which actually gave directions insofar as towns and routes were concerned. Even as morbid and cruel as the aforementioned instances were, yet some other American fighting men had been tortured to a miserable end, thereby hung wrapped in concertina wire spools, and then hung over an open fire to where the heat made the natural bodily reaction rip itself to shreds. Hence, a very slow and agonizing, miserable end. By now, seeing this all throughout the area, in terms of the PAP atrocities, the men were now stoic and hardened and filled with the total will to resist evil, especially of this type. It was indeed barbaric and medieval type of behavior, purely savage. But it did strike the fear and terror into the enemies of the CCP and its PAP paramilitary forces. Anywhere they were, resistors were either mercilessly slaughtered in enormous amounts, or they fled to other AOs without a PAP presence. This was the same thing Joseph over in Montana had done with fellow group leaders Troy and the former guard major. Troy, before his death, had seen the PAP and its atrocities and lost many men in skirmishes with them at first, thus causing him to merge with and join Joseph's element. Back in Ann Arbor, there wasn't much in the way of options. This was the enemy, and they had to be fought because they were here and literally pursuing the partisans. So thus they had to fight them. The PAP was the main force holding down the whole Ann Arbor area. 2 of their brigades and 1 KPA allied brigade along with them, making 3 in total. Those were who were present and thus needed to be dealt with, as unfortunate as that was. As the Diamond Group with Jacob now moved onward, continuing to use lower topography and other natural features to conceal them while they moved, they managed to quietly sneak past 2 small KPA roadside checkpoints en route to where they planned to stay for the night. This with the supplies they boosted from the KPA earlier. As they passed these areas, they did so with the utmost professionalism, discipline, and complete utter silence. The complacent KPA troops generally were minimalists, but in the sense of their military procedures and overall discipline. They absolutely could still be vicious foes, but were more complacent and simply unused to asymmetrical warfare than were the Chinese, who were masters in all forms of waging war, including irregular warfare. Silently, the small group crouched, walked on by, slow and deliberately, only utilizing hand signals when needing to communicate. Minutes later, they'd safely passed and could walk on a bit easier, all while, of course, remaining stuck to tree or dense undergrowth as a form of concealment. One ambush per day was generally what this group, the Diamond Men, kept it to. Had they done more, they'd either all end up dead, or they'd piss off the generals and the FOB so badly they'd send the PAP hunting directly for specifically them next. They already were beginning to make a name for themselves and end up on the BOLO report within the AO and on the PAP's shit list eventually as well. But right now, they tried to pass themselves off as any other groups out there, causing the same amount of trouble. Only they, in particular, left a calling card, while most other groups did not. Now, as the Diamond Men, now harboring Jacob for the time being, returned along with him to their temporary hiding place on the wooded outskirts of a farm, past some leveled, razed to the ground suburban areas, totally having been crushed beneath the weight of heavy artillery shelling and precision airstrikes from a squadron of JH-7s and 2 squadrons of Nanchang Q-5s as well. Both Chinese ground attack planes, highly capable of putting lots of heavy munitions upon many unfortunate enemy targets. Of course, they'd been utilized to support friendly forces earlier during the battle between the PAP along with the KPA against the local National Guard and initial reactionary armed civilian forces with them within the first 2 days of the invasion. Much of Ann Arbor and immediate vicinity had right away been heavily destroyed during the first initial 2 days of the invasion. By day 3, there were checkpoints upon the roads, and combat outposts began to be established as the PAP was largely deployed to block eastern inroads on the boundary of the Ann Arbor AO. Such an operation had been carried out to prevent partisans beginning to arise in Detroit, who'd been totally crushed, from then moving on into Ann Arbor's AO. By early day 4, one of 2 PAP brigades had rapidly redeployed 10 miles to jumping off points for a new operation within the Ann Arbor AO, which also even included its brigade's headquarters battalion present, of the brigade present, for logistical support of the rest of the brigade's combat battalions operating in the field. Therefore, instead of occupying its normal FOB position and thereby duties and functions there, one headquarters battalion remained from the other brigade, which was still deployed on the eastern AO boundary. Essentially, one battalion, its headquarters battalion, still being present in the FOB of that other brigade, while the other battalion of the redeployed brigade joined back up to lead it in the field and therefore also handle its resupply requirements. This operation, Operation Firewind 1, was a very apt choice of name for it, as the PAP went totally wild with its liberal usage of flamethrowers, as such incendiary weapons were among its favorite armaments used during counterinsurgency operations. Apart from that, the partisans were brutally crushed by the Type 62G upgraded light tanks, ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles, and Type 63 armor personnel carriers, as well as the WZ-551 wheeled armor personnel carrier and infantry fighting vehicle versions. These latter two utilized by the headquarters elements to boot. The PLA's artillery in the near distant neighboring AOs, as well as PLAAF ground strikes, came together in an orchestra of death and total destruction and decimation, all of which combined left virtually nothing left, with all the trapped partisans actually being KIA'd to the last man, as the area had thoroughly been swept once the trap had been sprung and the air and artillery strikes had thus been completed. Therefore, had the PAP won a big victory against the irregular, asymmetrical warriors trying in vain to resist their reign of terror. However, despite the official capitulation, official surrender that day, the PAP kept fighting all day and celebrated only upon their then deployed brigade having had all its battalions returning back into the FOB. This for a short rest and refit of their unit by the end of day 4. Having lost 90 of their men KIA'd and 115 WIAs, the PAP did well considering its fanatical use of aggressive infantry combat tactics, including on occasion charging enemy positions rapidly, acting as true shock forces. The partisans suffered gruesome losses, as their original near 2,000 odd men at the start of the battle only did some 200 or so make it out of the trap before it closed alive, with the rest brutally annihilated completely once being surrounded. Needless to say, the attrition rate was abysmal for the partisans, who lost in the beginning of the war many of their men per each occupier. Over time, matters would improve, though only slightly, as partisans got better and acquired better armaments to accompany their skills and experience thus acquired. Although, however, they'd still suffer immensely at the hands of the potent occupation forces within their daily life or death struggles levied against them. For a while, even months, the death toll would remain horrific as millions steadily perished from the fighting itself, or inadequate food and water, or not having food, clean food or water at all. Also, all manner of pestilences, diseases, many of which preventable, all of this thereby stemming from many being forced into nomadic lifestyles while being ill prepared for it. Bodies choked the streets and roads and towns and fields. Everywhere lay the dead, and far too difficult did it become to be able to properly dispose of them. These corpses contributed directly to all of the disease incurred by the Americans as rodents multiplied and spread diseases, causing mass illnesses and death. Concentration camps, or the Laogai system, or some temporary gulags ran by the Russians, also contributed to the high body counts. It all amalgamated together to make the single deadliest conflict in all of human history, and all within just one former nation, being the former nation of America. As a colony, America, now called New China, was heavily exploited as Red Chinese civilian colonists, moving in as opportunistic laborers, shared in the money being made on all the resources and exploitation thereof. Despite this, with a large war still on, the colonists began in the red zones, or the safe zones for colonial expansion operations. And also, the red zones were considered administrative areas as well as living areas. However, as time went on, and we to the Gurs were liberated by the Americans, they too would add some of the harshest activities and be the hardest proverbial punch to the nose of the Chi-Com forces present, as they disguised themselves with captured Chinese uniforms and the corresponding ID cards that were the closest matching to their facial features, as well as their knowledge of Mandarin. As technically still Chinese citizens, albeit severely persecuted second-class citizens, they still knew much about the CCP and its associated forces. They were beneath their yoke for as far as they could remember as a collective people, thus having their own thirst for revenge upon those who persecuted them. These new vital additions would therefore become the infiltrators necessary to make the partisans' biggest dreams and goals even be able to come into fruition. as many of these liberated we to the gers could pass as Chi-Coms themselves, when in there disguised for all of the aforementioned reasons listed. As such, they'd cause never before imaginable damage to some key Chi-Com facilities during the overall uprising and war against the occupation regime. As time would further elapse, Jacob surprisingly would gain the trust of his benefactors, who aided in his safety for a time, and begrudgingly, at least at first, made a very rare exception and allowed him into the group. Trust took long to be acquired on the part of Jacob. Not trust in the sense of possible betrayal, but trust in the sense of Jacob's abilities, leading to his only being permitted to be able to act as a posted guard or other duties for the group that didn't involve direct combat activities, rather more along the lines of what would be considered support. However, as more men of the Diamond Men partisan group had been lost, gradually speaking over time, Jacob was allowed to start tagging along officially on combat-related missions. This having began, of course, to occur upon months of his training with the group, having had, by this point, occurred for several months, which was the bare minimum required for the types of high-tempo activities undertaken by the Diamond Men partisan group. Originally, the tight-knit professional group had been comprised of, perhaps at its largest, what amounted to a small company-sized element, but now, however, ended up eventually relaxing some of its stringent requirements, such being done out of necessity to replenish the deceased over the course of the months, as they'd lost roughly 15 men so far in a several-month amount of time. Though fairly light in terms of capabilities, or as casualties, though fairly light in terms of casualties suffered, this was attributed to the group's methodology and tactics, as well as types of targets they attacked. While the group's losses were nowhere near or even close to the terrifying typical attrition rates of many other less overall capable partisan groups, it came down to still requiring necessary replacements just to be able to fill the number of bodies the group required. This as required for carrying out the same types of operations as had always been the case, and number of them also as had thus been customary for the group itself. Much of the fighting undertaken by the partisans involved fighting in the suburbs. Occasionally, well-coordinated strikes, when possible, to enter and leave the city of Ann Arbor itself. Ann Arbor had been long since Sino-fied by Chi-Com propaganda. Its remains thus adorned with red banners, the CCP party flags and national flags of China. While Ann Arbor's red zone was built into a Chi-Com colonial fortress for arriving colonists and troops, it faced still steady assaults by partisan groups, either nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving throughout the AO as a whole. Within Ann Arbor was several new intact structures recently built by Chi-Com forces and their slaves doing the menial labor. Rubble clearance had been started several months into the conflict within the city of Ann Arbor itself. Though not totally completed due to ensuing fighting from the war still occurring, the city was somewhat beginning to be cleaned up. There were now some barracks and also occupation-related administrative buildings, all of which were aptly decorated with the CCP imagery and flags, as well as the Chinese national flags as well. Their surrounding was many walls comprised of layers of Hescos and concrete T-walls, concertina, and barbed wire, with also some portable chain link fencing and even minefields outside of the red zone of the city, its former downtown area. Largely, though, much of the Diamond Group's fighting, in particular, occurred in the rural areas out around the suburbs and city itself. These ambushes and skirmishes consisted mostly of hitting small units as checkpoints and fringe outposts. Typically, were not heavily manned. Also, small patrols and convoys were hit rapidly in addition. In spite of the well-coordinated attacks, heavy emphasis was placed upon men. Heavy emphasis was placed upon men that were lost in the fighting over time by the group. However, the elite group's leadership by that point figured that anyone who was even still alive that could be recruited must have learned all they needed to survive the then current battlefield. As it stood, Jacob became more effective overall, and by the end of the first 7 months of occupation, he'd been brought along on some of the first assaults against the AO's main installation, which was the dual-purpose Transit Laogai and FOB combo base of operations. Of the 3 brigades within the Ann Arbor AO as a whole, using this as their main headquarters of operations. At first, the attacks against the installation were of a probing nature in order to feel out its security level, to be able to better tailor future planning accordingly. Such attacks being essentially recon in force operations. These largely consisted of mortar attacks from recently seized 82mm mortar tubes and mortars themselves from a KPA supply convoy having earlier been ambushed. Furthermore, these advanced onward to vastly more sophisticated attacks with ambushes against the gate in and out of the FOB side, and also the Laogai side entrance too. Of these were utilized again the mortars, but also added in now were anti-tank missiles fired from a wood line just beyond the minefield which surrounded the entirety of the dual facility. These AT missiles had a range of effectiveness from destruction of a guard tower and some perimeter fencing to nothing whatsoever at all. But soon there was a work detail of we to the slave laborers working in the outer suburbs several miles outside of the city. They were fairly decently guarded, but the assault was a hit and run style assault that ended up being very well timed and very well coordinated, with various men each taking their own specific mark for a rapid takedown. Synchronized firing, which mostly worked out well by eliminating a large portion of the two platoons then currently guarding the large grouping of prisoners. The rest of the guards, once snapping into red alert status, fought back insanely fanatically and even ended up eliminating some of the liberators off in the near distance. But this battle allowed many of the prisoners to break free of their captors, who later were picked up by the retreating Americans, who inducted and trained them as their now elite saboteur forces. Now, they, with captured enemy ID cards, uniforms, and men who could look and speak the part with their facial features and Mandarin language knowledge, could now take the fight into the Chi-Com installations themselves, leading to immense damages within 2 months after their liberation and subsequent training for the role was concerned. Jacob got to work with them on some occasions and built up quite an excellent working rapport with them, as they shared a lot in common, especially considering what occurred with Jacob's family early on during the invasion itself. Moreover, his own family had by this point long since been resettled into China. His son and 2 daughters were sent to a re-education Laogai for later release to a ghost city in a few years. His wife, herself, becoming a house slave for a member of the CCP elite, who was prominent within China's arms manufacturing industries, even retaining some privileges herself this way that most Americans just were never allowed altogether. Jacob would last several years into the occupation, but eventually met an untimely end in combat, he himself falling when multiple partisan groups, having long planned a full-scale assault upon the dual facility headquarters of the local occupation forces. This assault on these forces in their main installation managed to be carried out with plenty of determination and discipline on the part of the American partisan groups in participation together. It began with a well-timed mortar assault and gate attack, with we to the Gers inside using the attack sirens to gain easier entry into the munitions depot area, which was normally under intensive guard, intending fully to thereby blast it sky high, which they did indeed manage to pull off. These we to the Gers would rush into the depot while claiming to the gate guards within that they were running ammo to the perimeter guard forces, which during the potent partisan assault then occurring wouldn't even be questioned by the guard forces guarding the inner gate into the walled off depot inside the fob itself. While the attack was preset to pre-designated times due to a lack of communications equipment on the partisan side of things, and elements of it were highly successful, they were still violently fended off as a result. What had occurred was that Jacob and the Diamond Men, now highly armed and equipped with potent weapons, prepared to assault the dual facility, as the we to the Gers aimed to blast the ammo dump sky high with C4 charges intended to be planted on or under the shipping connexes, which contained the different tank shells and even some artillery shells held there for other local units as a logistical reserve supply for the local area. Meanwhile, the Diamond Partisans would lob 82 millimeter mortars into the fob. Upon the ammo dump blast occurring, which would mean the we to the Gers would have made it out by then safely, as well as the depot blasts to be thus blamed on apparently fortunate mortar strikes from the partisans upon it, this thereby covering the retreat of the we to the Ger forces, who themselves were to slip out of the fob side gate while pretending to be responding to the partisan attack. While conducting their escape, they'd do a pre-agreed upon wave to where the partisans would thus be able to avoid friendly fire. Yet such a wave, even not being a giveaway to the real Chi-Com and KPA forces present inside the dual facility. By the time they will have fled out, it will have been noticed far too late by the perimeter Chi-Com or KPA guard troops, then manning the guard towers, fortifications, and machine gun nests on the perimeter. Also, all-terrain vehicles with anti-tank missiles mounted on the backs would rapidly move forward then from the nearby woods to fire at the perimeter guard forces, as well as also utilizing captured heavy and general-purpose machine guns in much the same way. This assault would include another aspect, attacking the main gates of the Laogai and the fob side. All in all, a ruthless assault onto the loathed and hated and murderous PAP forces. Jacob's role would be in the gate assault onto the fob side by firing his Type 69 RPG rockets, with many others doing the same as he. This, along with a myriad of machine gun and small arms fire to boot. Insofar as assaulting the two gates was even concerned, it was done to suppress enemy forces just long enough to prevent them from rapidly emerging from the fob's gates to face the partisan forces, therefore on open ground outside of their installation. Such a response, by using their armored vehicles far more effectively as a result of such forces emerging from their fob, was indeed a major peril for the partisans, as of course such a response itself would end in sheer disaster for the attacking partisan forces. However, even the FOB, as fortified as it was with machine gun nests and guard towers and other fortifications, would be daunting and perilous enough. This, as it was acknowledged that penetrating the FOB's outer perimeter would be next to impossible due to the sheer numbers of enemies present within the dual-use facility. In addition to such, the gates themselves, one for the Laogai side and one for the FOB side, consisted of staggered concrete vehicle barriers leading out of both gates. These to a distance of some 150 meters out to the nearest road. In addition to these were one layer of HESCO-like earth-filled barriers, being only one layer tall. These were topped with concertina wire and therefore skirting both sides of the two 150-meter long gate pathways leading into and out of the Laogai and FOB gates respectively. On either side of the pathways, there lay deadly minefields around the outer perimeter fencing and fortifications. Needless to say, many would die in the attack, even though it seemed off to a decent start, and the charges did blast massive clouds into the sky with large rumbles. The enemy response was still that of a crack elite fighting force, as mortars now landed though we to the Gurs had already made their escape via running out the main gate, their leader having waved his left arm 4 times as a signal it was them, as they ran with weapons in their right hands. Under fire, they still safely managed to return to the partisan lines as rounds filled the air from both sides, with the partisan and Chi-Com side trying to avoid them, as the partisans knew the we to the Gurs to be their men, and the Chi-Coms wrongly assuming that they were their men as well. As minutes ticked by, matters intensified, as about 10 mortars of 82 millimeter were sent crashing into the FOB. Mostly, mortars were avoided on the Laogai so as not to harm the inmates present inside. After all, the ultimate goal of the Diamond Partisans was to liberate them from slavery in said Laogais. However, RPGs, anti-tank missiles, machine guns, and small arms were sanctioned for use, as upon the front structure of the Laogai was made of concrete modular cell houses, and it was assumed that it was unlikely that these weapons would harm anybody inside. PAP troops savagely fought back, although they'd lost some men by this point, some near the ammo dump when it blew, several others to the mortars, and troops in the towers and gate machine gun nests. Be that as it were, It was a relatively smaller number than the Diamond Men would have hoped. The heavily fortified dual facility, surrounded by minefields, except the gates. It was a bona fide fortress. Jacob and others still moved in according to their original planning, laying down immensely heavy firepower with all that they had to try to prevent enemies from coming out of the gates and after the men within the wood line, firing mortars and anti-tank missiles at the perimeter. There were now light tanks moving up towards the fob's gate on the fob side. There were the spaced out but staggered concrete barriers lining much of the entryway lane into and out of the fob. These were there to slow vehicles down by forcing them to turn by zigzagging around the different barriers in order to enter the gate as they approached it. Now, as partisans charged towards the gate, many took cover behind these concrete barriers as PAP fire flew their way, thus cutting many Americans down in the process, mostly those who didn't dive to cover beneath the barriers fast enough. If there was one silver lining, it was that these concrete barriers and one-layer tall HESCO barrier walls lining each side of the pathways into the gates actively served as fairly effective cover and even concealment for those attacking both the Laogai and Fob gates. This, as both were set up in literally the same manner as it related to the barriers on the entry lanes into and out of the fobs. Jacob bolted to the first barrier at the end of the lane and crouched down behind it. He now, sitting down with his back to it, loaded up an RPG anti-tank rocket. He then popped up and fired at the lead light tank moving up towards the gate from inside the fob. This light tank, being of course followed up by other vehicles, largely were stuck in a line for the time being. At least, such was the case until they could leave the fob to open ground beyond the 150-meter barriered lane leading into and out of the installation. Instantly, upon firing his RPG anti-tank rocket, it flew into the explosive reactive armor plating on the front of the tank, doing absolutely nothing to it. He then repeated his last movement by crouching down and loading his last rocket that he had on hand. He popped back up and fired again before ducking back beneath the barrier. He could hear the impacts, both of his rockets and others fired from additional RPG system wielding partisans likewise pinned down behind the different barriers. Alas, though, it was no use. These ERA kits vastly increased frontal and side protection on these light tanks, which gave the light tanks ample protection from rocket-propelled grenades in addition to other additional lighter anti-tank weapon systems. Now, the lead Type 62G rolled up beside the PAP gate guards, who ran in to retrieve the wounded, originally at the gate, and then to replace said wounded and the also now deceased by taking their positions on the perimeter. Now entering forces from other parts of the large fob now took their positions at the machine gun nests, guard towers, and other perimeter fortifications. Now, the coax machine gun on the lead light tank was sweeping the area, along with the tank's turret gunner upon his heavy W-85 12.7 millimeter machine gun. Also, tower guards had hurriedly moved up to replace those earlier KIA'd up in the guard towers, such occurring even amid all of the American forces' suppressive fire directed upon such areas during their assault. It was all beginning to go badly now, and the men in the close by woods, thereby according to their pre-timed planning, now pulled out according to their specifics on the timing. However, the men who tried to hold the gates were steadily being butchered now, as they found breaking contact to conduct a fighting retreat with the PAP was now nearly impossible. It wasn't that the contingent in the woods wanted to abandon their fellow fighters, who were then rushing the gates. Far from it. This occurred due to the fog of war and ensuing confusion as it related according to what to do should matters fail relating to the gate assault. They by now were running low on ammo, as all they carried in was rapidly being expended in the fighting. It wasn't in theory necessarily a bad plan. It was just a plan that was simply overestimated to succeed, insofar as the thinking of the group was concerned, relative to itself being prepared to take on bigger missions, or at least assuming they could do so. Even as professional and elite of an irregular element though they were, they couldn't fight a big force of equally elite fighting forces. As such was the PAP, being this exact sort of force. In addition, so was the PLA for that matter. Jacob, by this point, was literally pinned down behind the concrete barrier. He worried that if he got up, his ass would be thereby shot off. It was a real legitimate concern, as now the gate forces at the Laogai and Fob gates of the partisans were being brutalized. At the Laogai gate, the Laogai's armed QRF forces responded viciously, along with the armed perimeter guards and tower guards as well. On the Fob side, the PAP troops came with far heavier weapons and were tearing the partisans to pieces, vengefully for what they just did now to their ammo dump and attack, which with mortars, which caused immense damage to the installation. Mortars destroyed some of the buildings, and the ammo dump was essentially now a gigantic crater. In response, their hatred flowed upon the battlefield at their very gate of the Fob. Still having plenty of ammo within their vehicles and on their collective personage, this allowed them to carry out such brutal counterstrikes onto the partisans. They let loose now, firing their light tank shells a bit further away and ahead from the barriered entryway, all to let the partisans still clinging to life behind the barriers know now that they were trapped, with no feasible way out without being shred to bloody pieces in the literal sense if they tried somehow to bolt away and get to the woods. Jacob unslung his QBZ-95 rifle and raised up only to eye level above the barrier. and fired it. But by then, a replacement tower guard seen him revealing himself. And then it all went dark with a big, wet whap sound. Many partisans perished in the assault, including Jacob himself, while the gates were under the partisan attack. Dozens of well-trained, elite American fighting men fell in battle that very day. Although about half of the force had safely fled to fight another day and to lick their wounds, as in replenish their numbers and retrain new recruits to their standards for later use upon having had rebuilt their forces. On the enemy side, the PAP had lost 38 men KIA'd and about 85 WIA from the combo of the ammo dump sabotage and the mortar attacks, and an entire myriad of anti-tank missiles, RPGs, and rounds of various sizes and types. Certainly, out of 2 battalions present that day within the FOB, these casualties were fairly light, all things considered, although they in total added up to a whole company-sized element between both the KIA and WIAs, but these casualties were spread out between the 2 different battalions present. While 3 total brigades of occupation forces held down the entire Ann Arbor AO, many were out of the dual FOB Laogai facility, out in combat outposts, or even within the Ann Arbor Red Zone or colonial area, present there to secure such. The attack, though mildly successful, mostly due to destroying the ammo dump and blasting a few holes in the Laogai gate area's defenses, still didn't achieve the full aim of freeing inmates by destroying the mines and outer perimeter Laogai fencing. But the Diamond Group planned to continue their struggle. Beyond the failed attack, there were only 2 further such attacks levied upon the dual-use facility over the course of the war, with only the second of the 3 total ever coming even relatively near to full-on success. This due to 2 brigades being deployed off to other portions of the AO during that time, leaving vastly smaller guard forces present to deal with the tandem inner sabotage and accompanying perimeter blows, barely fending them off. By the time of the 3rd and final such assault, it was a total massacre upon the partisans, leading to any further series of such assaults being completely ruled out to thereby conserve manpower and resources for other uses, to therefore achieve more realistic goals. However, the we to the Gur saboteur forces never ceased their vital missions of infiltration, intelligence gathering, as well as, of course, their sabotage missions, which made a large impact on the enemy forces, even if it might not have seemed like it. Such had been the case because what could have been far more frequent and sometimes vastly more destructive counter-strike operations against the dwindling groups of partisans, these could have been far worse in intensity than what they already were. Such being the case, as enormous ground operations and sweeps eliminated millions in the ensuing years of war. Those we to the Gers who managed to survive combat or wiped out American resistance forces in general simply found other groups to join in order to continue their vital missions in support of the American struggle. These we to the Gers were more than happy not only to help a fellow persecuted people by CCP actions, but also in order to exact a sort of revenge for their own horrible experiences at their hands as well. Not that the occupation forces counterstrikes weren't already horrendously destructive on not only man, but even entire areas, but they might even have been bad enough to put an end earlier to all meaningful remaining partisan resistance had they not had this sabotage and intel gathering vital assistance gifted to them by the we to the Gers. This was even at times very much the case, as this very thing had been very close to occurring, relating to devastating apocalyptic counterstrikes levied upon the partisans. Moreover, even somewhat unbeknownst to the Chi-Coms and their intelligence services completely, their very selves. In other words, meaning even the Chi-Coms didn't realize how close to final victory and final success against the partisans that they really even were, due to how destructive their counterstrikes had been. Without the we to the Gers, these counterstrikes would have been even more devastating in certain areas of the land. This, as they had badly beaten down the partisans multiple times, even onto the verge of total oblivion, and didn't even fully know it. Had they been able to ascertain or infiltrate successfully many partisan groups, they'd see just how close to extinction became many of these groups at different points throughout the conflict, from the sustained heavy losses these groups thereby incurred. On the other side of the land, inside of Montana, matters occurring, though somewhat different from previously more developed areas, were indeed similar in many ways to what had occurred over in Ann Arbor, albeit perhaps with far better terrain, therefore aiding in the American struggle levied against the occupation forces by the partisans operating in the Montana area. Some groups even actually lasting to the final cessation of all hostilities occurring within the entire war as a whole. Even so, it was still never easy, and therefore many groups and lives in general were always being lost, and in massive numbers along the way. It was simply more a matter of outlasting, or rather outweighting, the enemy occupation. Of course, there were still major actions occurring throughout the entire counterinsurgency campaign against the Americans. And also the partisans included fighting operations of their own creation, but the fighting overall was more sparse within the Montana area. It was somewhat much more of a cat and mouse type of game, mostly in this particular region, as the partisans learned that they would not last very long at all if going toe to toe against the vastly and immensely stronger occupation forces. Instead, the partisans learned in lieu of this to do short, fast, and choppy strikes on the Chinese forces and their respective allies. The Americans also, in tandem with their combat actions incurred, learned to move far away from areas where they carried out their counter-occupation strikes to avoid the large and savage reprisals from ground and air power laid upon entire subregions. These resembling the Ho Chi Minh Trail carpet munitioning campaigns, but conducted by the Chi-Coms on a far larger scale. Of course, in addition to occupation forces' air activities, were the equally ruthless ground operations levied against the Americans. Partisan groups sometimes would even travel far from where their families currently were thereby encamped, just in order to carry out a strike themselves due to the retaliatory actions taken upon them. Such being carried out far from their families to ensure that the retaliatory counterstrikes would not fall upon the non-combatants within their groups. Oftentimes, massive overflights of H-6K heavy strategic bombers dropped many dozens of thousands of HE ordnances or incendiaries on the various wilderness areas comprising Montana. This, among similar areas throughout the entirety of the overall land as a whole, as this was common activity as the war went on and on. Such mass ordnance dropping missions were carried out on a quasi-regular basis insofar as preceding the different ground operation campaigns, or just as a form of regular disruption or steady harassment of enemy American partisan forces. Such resistors of the occupation thereby being shackled to the ground with no countermeasures of their own as it pertains to the American elements fighting the occupation. Only occasionally, when it pertained to helicopters, some lower flying drones, or when a ground attack jet occasionally flew lower on strafing operations, or sometimes to even drop their heavy payloads on target, could the partisans actually hit back with FN-6 or SA-7 man-portable air defense systems, or their equivalents, and only rarely when conditions aligned in their favor to even be able to do so. When they used such weaponry, they on rare occasions did prove enough of a threat to whereby they sometimes downed said helos or drones, and even just over a dozen times did they down ground attack jets throughout the entirety of the entire conflict. However, as it pertained to the latter, such only occurred after the first 4 months of occupation, when such means as the aforementioned air defense missiles became slowly more available as from raided supply convoys or even raids upon air defense units themselves, taking such weapons from the deceased. Of such armaments, they were never procured in enormous quantities, and thus were utilized extremely sparingly. This due to chaff and other countermeasures. They weren't always guaranteed hits with these systems, as this generally was an issue they faced. So, in order to enhance their chances at success, they tended to use these types of weapons in small clusters at one single time, thereby expending their hard-won resources in this area as a result. Despite these shortfalls in the case of the partisans, whenever they obtained an actual victory against an aerial-based aggressor force, it was always a big morale boost. After all, having no air power of their very own meant that the closest means available to dealing with these types of threats were captured air defense weapons. Of the ADA weaponry, or air defense artillery weaponry, the man-portable FN-6s and SA-7s, among other such arms, had originally been repurposed by the occupation forces from original local troop defense in order to instead now be used to deal with the potential threat offered by partisan drones, should any arrive ever onto the scene to attack the FOBs. Though unlikely as it were, such arms now serving as base defense weapons for FOB security against said drones, or at least possible drones, despite almost no air threats arising on the American side of things whatsoever at all. And therefore, these man-portable systems served as more of a precautionary armament as per standard operating procedure. Those air defense artillery weapons, of course, were present also among larger, better ones, vehicle-mounted and more, that were in the hands of the coalition's air defense units in particular. Other weapons, such as the occasional 57mm air defense artillery autocannon captured by the partisans, were highly valuable possessions in the realm of not only aerial countermeasures for the partisans, but against ground targets as well. Mortars, even occasional light artillery, multiple rocket launching platforms such as the short-range 130mm Type 63, and more, made their mark as captured weapons for the partisan resistance elements as well. Even noted as having had occurred rarely, heavier full-fledged field artillery pieces were captured by some groups, which offered temporarily for them some considerable firepower. Even so, such weaponry thereby made ideal targets to strike for the occupation forces themselves, as they could scarcely afford to allow the partisans to even be permitted to operate such destructive firepower against them, as such weapons weren't used as support for their own elements as it related to the partisans, being as they simply would be impractical due to how they operated as irregular type of forces. Instead, partisan forces utilized captured field artillery pieces to thereby hit CHICOM or allied installations themselves and rapidly, such as their forward operating bases and combat outposts as the ultimate harassment weapon against them. There was a case later on in the war wherein partisans near the tiny town of Broken Bow, Oklahoma, had used captured field howitzers from a then just barely overrun Chinese fire base in the foothills in order to hit their local main fob in the area, thereby doing immense damage to their runway along with whatever then currently sat upon it insofar as aircraft or supplies were concerned. This runway forward operation base strike, alongside some of the barracks buildings also present, were also hit by these captured howitzers in that one instance. These, though, were immediately destroyed within barely completing their first salvo against the fob, and before they were reloaded and refired again, as an airstrike had been immediately called in by the local unit's fob-based leadership on an extreme emergency basis. The combat aircraft being diverted from routine air patrols to the Broken Bow AO, thus came in and strafed and fired air-to-ground missiles and dropped whatever ordnance they still had on board the aircraft. These munitions utilized being from recent and immediately previously occurring air operations just before being diverted, having been conducted elsewhere. Then still being on board the aircraft, only to then serve as destroying the emergency captured howitzer targets, thereby radioed in by the command on the fob. In the case of events occurring in distant Montana, the partisan grouping of Josephs and the former guard majors had moved frequently to stay out of the way of local CHICOM National Militia paramilitary troops of their 4th Corps, itself being a large unit of some 32,000 overall personnel. Also, local People's Armed Police troops of the PAP, immediately after the formal capitulation of the American regime, were also likewise still present in the area along with 4th Corps, were likewise avidly hunting for the partisans as well, certainly intending to do the absolute worst things imaginable to them, should they have any encounters. Indeed, the PAP paramilitary forces were the least humane of all of the various formations fighting beneath the Chinese flag, mostly in regards to their treatment of prisoners and even enemy civilian populations in general terms. For now, although Joseph had been badly injured from his previously sustained gunshot wound, he'd undergone intensive primitive physical therapy, guided and administered by the medical personnel of his partisan group, most having had been civilian doctors, nurses, and even a dentist and pharmacist within the group during times prior to the war. Among them also were some former National Guard medics who escaped from the Billings, Montana battle, who then began to serve as the partisan elements' combat medics during encounters with enemy forces of the occupation troops. Eventually, after a few months had elapsed, Joseph made nearly a full recovery, relearning how to use his left arm, although still painful, as new muscle tissue made new connections over the past few months of his working through the injury. It had been a tough, harrowing recovery, but he once again re-engaged in combat experiences upon his ability to return to duty. Joseph was definitely not a malingerer, and as one of the two group leaders, as it then stood, moreover, was highly devoted to his role as such, whipping any newcomers to the group into organized, lean, and motivated fighting forces. He regularly acquired new men through decimated groups, surviving members amalgamating into his group. This was mostly due in part to Joseph's reputation as being a no bullshit leader with by now ample combat experience and excellent organizational skills on his part. It was true that despite the hand the partisans were dealt throughout the entire situation, some partisans far exceeded others in terms of their abilities, skills, knowledge, and experience. Joseph wasn't mediocre, but he was not elite either. He was just a grunt, but one who fought like hell and used what abilities he did possess to their fullest benefit. As a former NCO in the Marines, he had basic organizational skills down pat. Though never deployed overseas, his training within the Marine Corps had served him well throughout his combat situations while in his own nation. He developed into a superb leader despite being just a lowly mid-level non-commissioned officer in the Marine Corps. But now he and the former guard major developed a relationship somewhat similar to how old units were in the American Armed Forces, with a unit-level officer and non-commissioned officer. For example, an Army company or battery-sized unit, both being of the same size, one being for artillery, being the battery, would have a first sergeant and a captain as the top non-commissioned officer and officer, respectively speaking. Thus became the major and Joseph, who the former drafted the planning, which was reviewed by the latter, Joseph, for tactical feasibility. Also, Joseph led the organizational aspects and training, which remained a non-stop constant within his element. Eventually, the group's members restabilized several months into the occupation as a whole. Such with growth in size from the formerly low number of mauled remaining fighting men, raising back to that of about a battalion in size, with 800 men at its peak. However, there were fluctuations of the group's members as men joined or repeatedly fell in the different battles erupting. But there came times when the group began to acquire a vast arsenal of weaponry from supply raids on enemy convoys, foot patrols, and even the occasional combat outpost. Such raids were conducted from extremely cautious planning, all entirely intel-based from the group's human intelligence, or HUMINT, which is really all they even had possessed anyways. Insofar as human intel was concerned, the group had dedicated spies and sapper-like forces, of whom the former would get in close, or as close as humanly possible, to monitor a specific area, with the sappers acting as those who'd get into the perimeter to thereby clip concertina wire or demine areas where traps or mines were placed. Then, after several days of watching the enemy, the partisan spies would return with vital intel to aid in assault planning. Henceforth had Joseph and the Major's grouping become fully fledged professional fighting forces, who now were better organized and capable than they'd earlier been. In their humble beginnings during the invasion, they'd been utterly slaughtered in massive numbers. This nearly led them being totally vanquished as a fighting element. Although such had been the case, they made a comeback onto the scene, as their resurgence was a result of other stragglers and fighting men of additional but now defunct groups, thereby joining their group. This numbers boost came at perhaps the best possible time, as the Chi-Coms and their Russian allies were combing the state line region between Idaho and Montana quite vigorously, having forced the movement of different partisan groups, then moving on to other areas in order to escape new encirclement scenarios as a result of the sweeps. Finding out about these new operations, Joseph and the Major's forces moved again to the northeast and slightly away from their former area, within which they'd much preferred to operate within. Though they didn't realize it, their move was quite timely, as the PAP had joined in with sweeps of their very own, these occurring deeper within Montana itself, to the general east of the state line multiple times. Albeit unknowingly, this move out of their normal zone of nomadic movements saved the group from total extermination. The PAP forces moved in with the fullest intent to slaughter all found and take no prisoners in so doing. Had they been present in their area, if still present there, the PAP most certainly would have engaged and possibly cut them off, only then to surround them before annihilating all within the group in a set-piece battle. Such set-piece battles were sought to be avoided by any and all means, such by partisan elements with the brains to understand the very real perils of such engagements. As the stragglers were assimilated into the group, having fled from areas to the west, the PAP, likewise, now operating to the southwest, found nobody there amid the forested foothills of the large Rocky Mountains in the region. They instead found only signs of life, ranging from former campfires, some small quantities of unburnt trash, and dug-in living areas themselves. All in all, sites looking like abandoned Viet Cong encampments from the Vietnam War as a historical comparison of such sites. Furious at finding no partisans in their sweep, the PAP instead wiped out multiple unarmed civilians recently discovered hiding elsewhere during these large sweeps, many of whom neither had affiliations with Joseph's grouping nor knew of them altogether. Using flamethrowers on the civilians, the PAP troops opted to burn them all alive, and leave their charred remains on the local roads as a sign of their brutal repression. Only a very blessed handful, all things considered, were instead shot. Joseph and the Major ran their group as carefully as humanly possible, keeping their fires as low as possible down to embers and digging in everywhere that they went, as well as even maintaining very strict noise discipline. Overall, Joseph and his group stayed within certain safe zones of the forest, insofar as pine cover was even concerned. After all, coniferous trees camouflaged IR signatures from roving drones and recon planes, not to mention obscuring the view of satellites higher up as well. As winter was now being dealt with, the partisan dugouts were definitely adequate enough for some heat to prevent cold weather injuries, as underground areas were filled with sleeping partisans along with their related non-combatants, all huddled together with them for warmth. As far as such was concerned, the cold still managed to permeate even within the warmer underground dugouts and primitive earthen bunkers, but it was at least survivable. Even if it was uncomfortable, the partisans had lived through their first winter under foreign occupation. By the 6th overall month of the war, the Russians had themselves began to pull out and back north to their own territory of the Neo-USSR, part of which now consisted of the 3 Arctic Canadian territories and, of course, Alaska. Upon all the Russians having been pulled out of the lower 48, they went north to their newly annexed lands. Of the other nations that intended on pulling out, Belarus planned to stay a little bit longer, but then to join their Russian brethren by leaving themselves at the 1-year mark. Their orderly withdrawal, insofar as the Belarusian forces, was supported and facilitated by the Russians, who allowed their close-knit Belarusian allies easy passage home through Alaska, then through Siberia, and onto European Russia to reach home itself, Belarus. The other nations still there beyond a year were either those bonded and obligated to China in the long term, such as North Korea and Pakistan, even Iran and Cuba. Other nations like Nicaragua, Venezuela, as well as Honduras and even Syria had small contingents present in country. Of course, deploying troops as payment for owing China on their generous loans and projects. As time went on, China raised up newer group armies as well as juggled the multiple millions of personnel they already possessed since the start, all of which was needed as occupation of a nation the size of New China, or the former USA, which required ample forces in regular rotations. Owing to this, long-term conflicts required regular rest periods for troops as well as training up newer recruits. But due to China's sheer size and industrial might, they were easily able to do this. Equipping the new armies was simple enough, and technically, well over 1 million troops could be raised up in 1 year or maybe even less, as China had ample training installations for exactly this purpose. As some of the foreign forces started to pull out little by little over time, China was still able to fill the void with their 29 million men under arms. They had their military and paramilitary forces on 2-year tours of duty, all with 1-year return periods per each unit. That meant that on an average span of a soldier's career, they'd deploy at maximum 3 deployments, or in rare cases, perhaps even 4 per man. Reasoning for this was the extreme longevity of the whole conflict itself, lasting a duration of many years consisting of brutal occupation and suppression. Joseph and the Majors Group, having co-opted multiple weapon systems, could begin to carry out vastly more complicated assaults as their planning improved upon previous mistakes or lessons learned. Indeed, lessons learned and improvisation served well this group in resisting the occupation forces. They at one point had acquired several Chi-Com VP scout vehicles resembling a mix of a Chinese / Humvee hybrid sort of a vehicle. Having had mounted several captured 57mm guns on them, these made outstanding hit-and-run assault vehicles now. They managed with these to attack several combat outposts, as well as multiple roadside checkpoints and even scattered foot patrols of the occupation forces. With these weapon systems and mortars and even the rarely seized FN-6s, Joseph and the Majors Group managed to not only give the Chi-Com fringe garrisons a proverbial bloody nose, but they even shot down 2 Chi-Com Z-20 utility helicopters, flying troops to a local FOB, these forces coming in from an aerial hub at a mega FOB within easy helo flight distance to the subordinate FOB. This drew the immediate wrath from the local Chi-Com forces, as by the time these attacks by the partisans really began in earnest, the 75th Corps of the National Militia had been rotated in, replacing the 4th Corps of the same paramilitary element. Also, the 43rd PLA Airborne Division, along with the PLA's 53rd Entire Group Army and PAP's 50th Armored Division, the latter having had served during the invasion at the capture of the whole Norfolk, Virginia area, playing a key role in that operation. Otherwise, the 53rd Group Army of the PLA and 75th Corps of National Militia of China had already been deployed in the Northwest during the invasion of the USA as a whole in its very initial phases. These specific units had been shuffled around for good reason, and due to this particular mountainous area being seen as a trouble spot by the CCP regime's high command, thereby sent these potent units in to strike down the partisans. Previously, the 43rd PLA Airborne Division had been further south during the actual initial invasion phase itself, along with also the 44th PLA Airborne Division, too. Both had been utilized in the rapid capture of the local key military areas along I-25 and in the mountains themselves, along with the locally stationed, much heavier Trojan shock forces also there at the time. These two airborne divisions being parachuted in at the time as part of the external components serving as reinforcements to the Trojan shock armies. Essentially, for the general central and western Montana AO, this was the perfect balance of heavier and lighter units, allowing for these deployments to control the high and low ground simultaneously, with the lighter and heavier units respectively speaking. 2 years in, this deployment was occurring just as the partisans were making their impact on the occupation troops scattered in the wilderness roads and foothills. Now they'd run into real trouble, with even more enemy units and personnel to really spread out and in strong numbers to comb entire areas of Montana and adjacent states. This being done via massive cordon and sweeps at that. Not that the forces originally in the area weren't plenty enough to contend with. They were. It was just them trying to do too many things at one time, like spreading out in way too many small, far-flung garrisons, while also requiring too many foot patrols in areas where roads were lacking, and in higher elevation to boot. At one point, Joseph's men had attempted to attack a higher up in elevation Chi-Com fire base, whereupon there was an artillery battery with lighter towed 59 130 millimeter howitzers. During the initial invasion, these howitzers, as being part of the 43rd Airborne Division's two different divisional artillery battalions within their subordinate batteries comprising them. These forces were parachuted into Colorado at the time, along with the paratroopers of the infantry-based forces of the division, including, of course, the division's full complement of lighter air-mobile vehicles and logistics. This particular fire base, now manned by these airborne artillery troops of the 43rd PLA Division, had wreaked havoc upon the partisans numerous times whenever scattered garrisons came under assault by the partisans and called for fire upon the attacking partisans. Accounting for over 150 KIAs from blasting shells, Joseph and the major agreed quickly that they needed a real plan to take out the enemy's local fire base. Having finally found it, upon sending out the spies to look, all the spies returned at a pre-designated time, as timing-based planning would make up for the lack of any rapid communication equipment available. Metaphorically, it was taking lemons and trying to make lemonade insofar as using such means available went for the partisans. Now they sent the majority of the spies and sappers upon their return to go to the fire base to quietly probe it and gather vital intel on the ground. Finally, the men then attacked the fire base, including using their 3 VP scout vehicle mounted captured 57mm guns, firing up and at the base's HESCO-like barriers and sandbagged walls. These certainly had the potential to do enormous damage with their gigantic blasting-tipped ammunition. There also was armor-piercing 57mm ammunition, which had the potential to tear through and totally defeat multiple layers of sandbags if they weren't dense enough overall in terms of their layering. The Chinese-made HESCO walls could withstand the blasting ammo, but not the armor-piercing ammo as long as it was fired multiple times into the same spot. When the assault commenced, the battery from a battalion of the 129th Airborne Artillery Regiment, being subordinate to the 43rd PLA Airborne Division as a whole, were they who then currently manned the fire base and fought back with extreme tenacity, holding their perimeter with troops manning crew-serve heavy machine guns, thereby returning fire upon the suspected partisan positions during the attack. While the battle erupted, others among the artillery batteries sighted in their howitzers while trying to hit the 57mm cannon-wielding vehicles, themselves earlier seized from the Chi-Coms, now armed and in service of the Americans. Of the forces, the FDC of the battery of artillery tried to get the coordinates of the enemies to see if the guns could fire close enough to land direct blows upon them. Soon enough, the spotter drones relayed the coordinates to the FDC, who sent down the fire missions to the troops manning the guns. There were 8 field howitzers within the battery, and only 3 were already spun up and ready to fire. Others were sat in preset positions, but not manned currently, as the crews had become infantry squads to be able to return small arms and machine gun rounds against the attacking partisans. Despite such, the other 3 gun crews loaded up HE shells with PD fuses and used 1 green charge, the smallest charge, and fired up at about 78 degrees to where the shells landed almost like mortars, thereby falling straight down upon the heads of the partisan forces. Blasting their fairly moderately powered shells upon landing, these blows instantaneously wiped out a few dozen partisan attackers and injured multiple more. These guns had to be put out of commission and fast. After all, the fire base was built upon a mountainside, similar to former American combat outposts within Afghan or in the jungle-covered mountains of Vietnam. Here, it was on a forest-covered mountain slope in the USA, and the shells now rained down close to it, killing unfortunate partisans within the target area. Mainly, the artillery cannon crews were trying to destroy the biggest threat to them, the portable 57mm guns, now on the move as they fired. They moved and fired, moved and fired. They continually hit the base in different areas as 12.7mm fire from crew-served machine guns were levied downhill upon the partisans who were firing upward from cover and concealment positions on the mountain below. Be that as it were, they were being wiped out by the savage guns bit by bit. But those who moved in closer to the perimeter were safely under the guns, as the saying went. Essentially, they were beneath the arc of the fire and could only thereby be hit by the small arms wielded by the infantry-like cannon crews, now wielding such weapons. Now it was man-to-man with the small arms fire. Joseph and the Major's men operated with small unit military tactics in squads and platoons of their very own. They moved up in their wedge formations to hit the perimeter, which itself took a heavy beating from the 57 millimeter ammo fired earlier. By this time, however, the 57 millimeter guns of the partisans fell silent for two specific reasons. One being the ammo was now low for such and needed to be conserved for other future missions, and the second reason being that the partisans, now near the perimeter, needed to avoid friendly fire coming from them. Exchanging rounds now with the Chi-Coms, the partisans attempted to overrun the firebase. Unfortunately for the partisans, they were violently forced to break off contact with the PLA artillery troops, whose firepower was just too overwhelming. They'd already killed many partisans by using their 130 millimeter howitzer shell fire, and even also their small arms, including their crew-served machine guns. As for the PLA losses, their 150-man strong artillery battery lost 20 KIAs and 35 WIAs. Some of the wounded were severely so. Despite their losses, the PLA held their fire base by themselves without any support apart from their own artillery supporting their erstwhile crews, becoming infantry forces in order to defend their perimeter positions of their fire base. Medivac helos were called in, and the partisans collected quietly whomever of their own wounded they could take with them, while the medevac helos came to pick up the wounded and deceased Chi-Coms. Usually, all-terrain vehicles or stolen small Chi-Com vehicles served as medevac ambulance-type vehicles for the partisans, besides their use as hit-and-run mobile gun/mortar/anti-tank missile platforms. As the massive Chinese forces rotated into the area, now settled into it, the leadership over the whole force, now massed here within Montana, now felt he could better allocate all his huge forces by consolidating some of the former combat outposts and checkpoints by closing down those deemed unnecessary and further fortifying those deemed as militarily essential. Due to it being such a vast expanse of land, there were still many American civilians out there in hiding, barely surviving, some off of the mercy of the partisan groups who could render them some kind of aid as they lived the life of a fugitive on the run. PAP armored troops operating older, albeit highly upgraded, main battle tanks now had the Type 59D and new turret model, the Type 59G series. As well as those, there were some Type 6979 series used by some of the tank battalions as well. These tanks were still extremely lethal on the modern battlefield due to their upgrades, but were hand-me-downs formerly from the PLA, who had the best of everything, all the newest tanks, all the newest vehicles in general. The PAP also utilized armed robots distributed in certain units of theirs, of the humanoid bipedal and quadrupedal dog robots with machine guns and anti-tank missiles mounted atop them. These sometimes proved quite effective, with the only downside being that reloading these weapons in the field was, at times, a difficult endeavor which required human intervention to be able to complete. Also, partisans used countermeasures such as nets and pits to trap some of these robots, to then disable them and steal the weapons mounted on them on rare occasions. Besides the PAP, the PLA, of course, also had robotic combatants used often by engineers or attached to various special operations units within the myriad of group armies. Even so, the PAP was regarded as the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime and was thus given extremely adequate armaments when compared to all of the giant third-rate units of the massive paramilitary elements. They were typically, as it related to the PAP, Category B forces, meaning they were still highly effective and well equipped, with even some Category A PAP units being the most elite of their forces. One such being the Snow Leopard Commando Unit, which was a small battalion, if it could even be called that, essentially 4 companies of what was a tiny PAP battalion of Special Operations Forces and were some of China's most elite. Moreover, though, each PLA group army had a Special Operations battalion or sometimes even a whole brigade attached, thereby adding immense capabilities in the sense of asymmetrical means, while yet still being a military force. These forces were incredibly capable at partisan hunting operations, and as the units rotated in while the older ones left out, they now prepared their logistics for upcoming operations being planned. This, in and of itself, inadvertently gave the partisans a little time to rest and recuperate. But they still had to watch out for aerial threats or common patrols on land. For the most part, though, they'd be able to plan for themselves their next moves. Joseph and the former guard major lamented and mourned their now deceased comrades and vowed to try again to assault the firebase, but chose to take more time to come up with a much better plan. Of the PLA artillery troops, they too planned for the next time by fixing their perimeter walls and further reinforcing them with thicker earthworks and fixing sabotaged concertina wiring, having been clipped by ballsy partisan sappers moving in extremely close in order to do so. Now they even added a nasty surprise in addition: anti-personnel mines around the perimeter walls outside and in front of the concertina wire fencing. As for the back, alongside the slope of the mountain itself, they had their entry point, including concrete T-walls, to give them a tall back wall as it related against the slope. There were the prefab concrete drainage ditch pieces that typically line suburban roads and streets in general. Now the PLA and other Chi-Com forces utilized these for mortar bunkers in order to take cover within, similar to how these molded concrete pieces were even spread out on American forward operating bases and outposts inside of Iraq and Afghan. Now the roles were reversed. It was the Americans now being hunted within their land, now occupied, totally filled with enemy bases of different sizes and types. Of the artillery fire base, the shipping container or connex present there was itself covered in layers of sandbags to protect the shells themselves from munition strikes levied against them, such as mortars. However, it was a hell of a fire base, and with even an earthwork but fortified bunker for the company captain and NCOs. It would be this base where the major would fall in combat, all as he led an element of the partisan group up on the other side of the same mountain to strike from the back of the fire base itself. Only then this group, including the major, to then be hit by a pair of J-10 fighter jets on routine patrol. These jets, now armed with ground attack munitions, as air superiority, of course, was already achieved on day one of the invasion, with the destruction of the USAF. Now, in occupation duties, fighters were retasked in order to hit ground targets, alongside the regular aircraft built specifically for ground strike missions, such as the JH-7 or Q-5 or J-16D electronic strike aircraft. As the major and his whole company-sized force he led were spotted via the artillery company's own spotter drones watching the area, the airstrike was thereby called in on an emergency preemptive strike basis. This to avoid the partisan attack headed for the gate of the firebase itself, in the back of it. Next, the 57mm guns were then struck once they gave away their positions, with 2 of 3 being destroyed by a salvo of 5 of the 8 total howitzers firing at their vicinity of movement. Only 1 managed to flee away upon the artillery and then air power even joining in once they hit the group traversing the mountain at the time. Strafing the forests, they hit many fleeing partisans in a massacre, which ended up as a decisive victory for the Chi-Coms, as this attack of the partisans failed spectacularly, with even no casualties this time suffered by the PLA side, unlike what had occurred in the first attack, where there was more of an element of surprise. One of the sappers then perished even from an AT mine, an AP mine, anti-personnel mine, with others falling as they attempted to demine the area for what was supposed to be the main attack from the partisans then currently in lower altitude positions who were to head up the mountain to attack as they'd done previously. They were cut down by the hail of small arms fire levied on them from several squads on perimeter guard duty. As a result of this tremendous loss, including one of the leaders, Joseph himself now abandoned all further attempts upon the firebase until enough heavier weapons could be acquired in large enough numbers, as well as enough time having elapsed for it to become another surprise assault. For a while, Joseph bided his time and stopped all activity within the normal area inside of Montana by moving to the direct south and into Wyoming's Rocky Mountains. Here, North Korean KPA troops manned this area, which Joseph had seen as his opportunity to beef up his men. Unlike the PLA, PAP, and other Chi-Com forces, the KPA, or Korean People's Army, while decently equipped, was overall more comparable to the third-rate Chinese forces insofar as how they managed themselves and used their capabilities accordingly. These KPA troops indeed had plenty of heavy weapons, and Second Corps of the KPA was still in the entire western Wyoming territory as occupation troops for this sparsely populated, albeit large, mountainous area. They seldom chose to launch anti-partisan operations in the mountains themselves, as they didn't have the very long-term experience of counterinsurgency warfare that China had, both from Xinjiang operations and to a lesser extent operations in Tibet as well. Ruthless though the Chinese forces were, the KPA was harsh as well, but easier to get the proverbial drop on, so to speak. Meaning the KPA forces were a bit more complacent and scattered themselves around in tiny platoon-sized garrisons in many areas, with a main combat outpost for control of all the far-flung fringe outposts. It was a strategy that made sense on paper, but the partisans had better odds fighting against the smaller forces arrayed in this manner by which they were deployed here. Joseph got in with big forces compared to those he attacked, and as a result, wiped out small KPA platoons and even the occasional company at their outposts near the mountains, but not up in them. Here, the KPA only sent in road patrols and small foot patrols into the mountains of 1 to 2 companies at the largest, which Joseph easily managed to avoid, being well seasoned in mountain combat by this point. Although the KPA wasn't as thorough or avid in how they prosecuted their operations, they still proved to be a tough foe with artillery, tanks, armored vehicles, and even their own air power usage in decent numbers. In theory, he may have stood a chance against some of the moderately sized 1 to 2 company sized forces that tried to pursue them through the mountains. Even so, with the then 430 men he had left remaining upon the previously failed second firebase attack in Montana, he thought better of it and refused the big risks inherent with such fighting against larger KPA units. Higher casualties wouldn't be worth it here, as Joseph was actually trying to build up, while all the while incurring minimal losses to his group. He ended up spending ample time in the mountains of Wyoming, although eventually he gained notoriety here, as he'd by the 5th month's time ambushed dozens of KPA scattered garrisons and small patrols, obtaining plenty of anti-tank missiles while doing so. Among other weapons, Joseph gradually built up his forces. While in Wyoming, Joseph found many nomadic wanderers and refugees who'd settled here high in the mountains, as for the time being it was technically the safest place anyone could possibly be, even if only temporarily speaking. Every so often, there were Chinese airstrikes and outright carpet munitioning raids upon the mountains here, and even the Korean People's Army Air Force joined in as well, with a few of its forward deployed squadrons now in country present to offer direct support to their own KPA ground troops. This alongside of the Chinese help often received within the KPA's AO, sent in to assist their KPA allies. The Harbin H-5, a Chinese-made older medium bomber that still equipped the more antiquated North Korean Air Force, were themselves already quite highly devastating. This, as of course, these aircraft still managed to be able to carry a decent payload of ground strike munitions, although only somewhat more comparable to what most ground attack jets carried in terms of total payload weight. Also used by the Korean People's Army Air Force were Russian made MiG 29s and 23s, and even older Chinese made J 7s and Russian MiG 21s. Both of the aforementioned being essentially, for all intents and purposes, the very same platform, albeit the Chinese J 7 came with more modifications being conducted over the years than it had previously while during production. Essentially, the Korean People's Army Air Force was excellent when it came to repairing and maintaining old aircraft, and thereby keeping them relevant. This, of course, in the sense of combat usage and still being useful in certain aspects. Despite having been largely maintained to merely guard their own airspace, the Korean People's Army Air Force was now able to deploy overseas as the vastly larger and more technologically advanced PLAAF of the Chicoms and VVS of the Russians had obviously gained total air superiority on the first day of the invasion. In so doing, the air power of smaller allies was now welcomed in as additional support for the ground troops operating in country, even though it really wasn't needed at all, as what the PLAAF had was simply overwhelming power, and it was just, the foreign air forces was just what one could call the proverbial cherry on top of the cake in terms of air power. There were overall roughly 212 KPAAF aircraft deployed in country of the aforementioned types listed earlier, now oriented at ground attack since the Sino-Russian coalition invasion had wrested total control of the airspace immediately in the invasion. Within the KPA's occupation zone, though, it was far easier on the partisans for a whole host of reasons, which prompted many to flee the Chinese for more of a chance at a possible recovery or group refit, and maybe even some rest. It all depended on activity levels of both occupier and occupied. Being that the KPA lacked sufficient counterinsurgency experience, it took them time to gain experience at fighting irregular forces, as they were a military tailored for fighting other regular military forces rather than irregulars. For now, Joseph kept ambushes moderately limited, as he became paranoid the more he carried these out, due to the threat of possible counter strikes from artillery, air, or even drone strikes. Occasionally, there were even enormous strikes from Chi-Com heavy strategic bombers flying a carpet munition mission here or there to help their Korean allies, jettisoning their massive payloads of munitions onto targets. When the aforementioned even occurred, many areas lay in total desolate ruination as a result. Even in lower laying areas, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles with complement of armor personnel carriers became a real danger too, which kept Joseph operating at as high of an elevation as was possible in order to possibly restrict enemy movement of such heavy vehicles. But eventually, after a few more months and even gathering new fighters into his group, he returned back north up the mountains and into Montana to work with other surviving partisan groups returning there or still even remaining there in order to battle the much more potent Chi-Com occupation forces. It was hit and run, and Joseph got away with switching to fighting smaller units in a fast style via using all-terrain vehicles and stolen small quantities of VP scout vehicles with weapons mounted in order to race in and hit the Chi-Com units fast and hard before then retreating in great haste to avoid quick retaliation and all manner of counterstrikes that they knew would come, as the Chinese never slacked when it came to their military manner. With Joseph using these tactics more frequently, he found he lost far less men doing it, while still managing to chisel away ever so gradually at the occupation forces. This, despite it being very little insofar as actual harm done to the enemy forces was concerned. Yes, Joseph missiled and mortared Chi-Com units and fled away as fast as possible. He sometimes got a few of them, and sometimes they got some of his men as well, unfortunately for him. There came a time when Joseph's group discovered far outside of Bozeman proper, along a paved road, a Chinese sub-camp of the local Bozeman proper Laogai system. This was being constructed outside of a recently discovered deposit of palladium, one of several key metals Montana was known for, including among others like platinum, silver, and copper, thus making Montana a key economic area for CCP colonization since the start. There had already by this point been a well-established Laogai at Bozeman, which became a permanent station for PAP units rotating in and out of country. Such was originally a camp for POWs and, of course, civilians, armed or unarmed, to be kept for transit to other facilities. Upon formally becoming a main camp, it had been expanded and built adjacent to a major permanent PAP FOB right next to it. This FOB contained several battalions of combat forces, along with accompanying logistical and administrative forces to boot. As for the Laogai subcamp, it was being constructed by a combination of to-the-Gur and American slave laborers, for the express purpose of being adjacent to the mine as it related to the recently discovered palladium deposits. This subcamp Laogai was off a ways from Bozeman, roughly 10 miles or so, which itself meant it wasn't directly next to any major groupings of Chi-Com or Allied troops, as the larger groupings of troops close by in Bozeman would take minutes to scramble and drive out on the local routes to arrive at this subcamp. In and of itself, such facts allowed for a rapid strike by the partisans operating from the forests, at least so long as they took no longer than 25 or maybe 30 minutes at the absolute longest to conclude their assault. Before the camp had been officially completed, Joseph launched a hit-and-run style raid on the facilities to liberate both the Americans and to-the-Gur slaves. Of the PAP guards present, there were only in the immediate vicinity about the Laogai then under construction, some perhaps only one company's worth of them. Of the PAP guard forces, many were armed with QCW-05 submachine guns, which fired 5.8 by 21 millimeter pistol ammo, whose max effective range was about 200 meters, although the area targets from such weapons could be hit as far out as 400 meters. but it would be wildly inaccurate at that range. Also, others, however, were equipped with QBZ 95B carbine rifles and QJY 88 machine guns used as a squad automatic weapon. These lighter equipped PAP paramilitary forces were headquarters troops serving as camp guards and not as frontline combat forces, they themselves being a detachment from one of the combat battalions within the local vicinity, located a bit further off in Bozeman. Although these headquarters troops were utilized as camp guards due to being classified as non combat forces, typically possessing more administrative job classifications, meaning these PAP camp guards were usually more akin to administrative clerical workers or support troops, as such being their respective units' headquarters elements. Technically, like many paramilitary organizations the world over and history over, they already had special policing powers to begin with, alongside of their use as fanatical combat forces, utilized against both regular and irregular enemies, being very similar in nature and composition to the German SS in World War II, at least in those ways. They, therefore, in the case of the camp guards, were somewhat more simple to deal with as opposed to far more potent PAP combat troops, of whom the partisans would not have stood any real chances of defeating, being due to their heavier weaponry and direct combat training. The aforementioned, along with the years of experience in counterinsurgency warfare in mostly Xinjiang, but also even Tibet. Joseph's group had, using the element of surprise, initially picked off those wielding the machine guns and makeshift temporary guard towers first, before then also firing upon the rest from the wood line of the forested foothills. This battle erupted and ended nearly as fast as it began, lasting literally only a matter of overall short minutes, lasting not even 20 minutes in total. Upon the aforementioned erupting, Americans on all-terrain vehicles rushed forward to fire anti-tank missiles off their backs of them, RPG-styled rocket weapons, and their own machine guns at the remaining guards still fighting. All as others signaled to the slaves to flee towards the forest under the cover of the partisan fire on the guards. While all of this occurred simultaneously, there were several captured enemy 82mm Type 87 mortars fired to help create chaos and break the attention of the guard forces on the inmates, all to allow them to escape. All while the guards in the towers were picked off and all-terrain vehicles rushed out to fire their various mounted weapon systems. All of the listed events occurring in tandem, as many of the Laogai fences were not yet even fully completed, and as such, allowed for many of the prisoners serving as slave laborers to flee, even as many were also being cut down as a result of trying to escape the guards. Of the several to perhaps 500 total inmates present, about 80 were too scared to even attempt to flee their captors, while about 140 were cut down in a hail of rounds coming from the guards, while yet all the rest had scattered and eventually made their way into the forests. Once within the relative temporary safety of the wood line, most were picked up and evacuated to full freedom out of the immediate vicinity. Of course, such occurring just before enemy air and artillery strikes came in, along with reinforcements arriving from Bozeman itself. All of the dangers of such having been called in by the Laogai PAP guards about 20 minutes into the overall attack, leading, of course, to the first strikes arriving about between 5 to 10 minutes of the inmates actually escaping the entire area, with Joseph's group of partisan forces in tow with them. Also came reinforcements from the local PAP combat battalions located 10 miles away in Bozeman. These troops arrived a bit too late, and although they helped the surviving guards to secure the area and remaining inmates who failed to flee, they were unable to find any deceased or living enemies, minus, of course, those killed in action in the firefight when they searched the nearby forest post artillery and airstrikes. In other words, Joseph's group, although having lost about 28 killed in actions with 37 wounded in actions in the firefight with the PAP guards, they themselves largely got away with the liberated inmates before the heavy response came in onto their former positions. Of the 135-man PAP guard company, they lost about 23 men, with 32 men wounded in action. Meaning, Joseph's assault achieved its aims of liberating Laogai inmates, and even managed to KIA a fair number of the then present guards, while also wounding some of the others. Attacks such as these, while occasionally mildly costly on the partisans, left a major psychological impact on the occupation forces, themselves forced to come to terms with the perils that could jump out at them anytime and any place. While true that many slaves and some partisans were eliminated by the time they melted away back into the forest, they'd narrowly avoided being slaughtered by the time the air and artillery strikes had come in. Now the liberated inmates, both American and we to the GER, would go on to contribute to manpower and capabilities of Joseph's partisan element, leading to successful sabotage operations that forced the Chi-Coms to become increasingly paranoid within their own installations throughout the area. Also, as such was unknowingly becoming a bona fide peril to the occupation forces throughout the entirety of the land, as many vengeful we to the GERs were liberated and joining these different partisan groups the land over, they now had to constantly be on guard for such acts of sabotage, which sometimes hindered optimum operational readiness. Also, as bigger targets began to be hit by we to the GERs that never could have been hit otherwise by just the Americans operating alone. This sometimes even took a toll on smaller occupation units themselves, as they'd sometimes lose entire ammo and logistical dumps to well-coordinated blasts. This forcing local commanders to have to coordinate bringing in replacement supplies, which cost time and effort to do so. Such occurrences sometimes even caused whole actions and operations within some areas to be postponed until the new supplies arrived. After all, armies cannot operate effectively, or even in some cases, even at all, without available and ample logistics. As these things happened, it gave the partisans breathing room in order for them to be able to survive, and even unbeknownst to them entirely, sometimes prevented their whole groups from being wiped out by simply buying them just enough time to move as units literally lost the time to act whenever they lost big numbers of their supplies. There had once been a massive sweeping operation planned and coordinated to actually comb a specific area within which contained Joseph's group. However, we to the Gers managed to blast several major ammo depots, causing, therefore, a 2-week delay, which bought Joseph's group enough time to leave that area. This inadvertently saved them from total annihilation, as had the sweep began when intended. Joseph's partisans would have been totally exterminated by the resultant operation. Matters continued for a time just like this, largely tit-for-tat actions and operations initiated by both occupation forces and partisans alike. There would be carpet munitioning of whole regions of forest, similar to how the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been likewise obliterated in the same way. Also, enormous ground attack aircraft precision strikes called in on specific areas, which itself was immensely destructive in its own right, as was the vast array of rocket and howitzer artillery usage. In return, the partisans conducted their sabotage actions and harsh, albeit very costly on their part, hit-and-run assaults. By the third year of the war, the partisans had lost many tens of thousands of lives in just the southwest region of Montana. But we're now left with a core of highly experienced and well-organized forces who were beefed up by the constant training regimens to keep them from getting rusty in combat. As such was now the case, they got to where they lived by combat, as it related to the partisan forces. Even so, immense life was still continually lost on their side as matters stood, although the playing field was somewhat more leveled out from the accruing of better weaponry to match the experience likewise gained by the American forces. As the Chi-Coms and their allies lost hundreds or sometimes even thousands of men over time, the Americans and their liberated We to the Gur allies lost literal millions. Though eventually this number decreased somewhat to just tens of thousands by later in the war. Of the aforementioned was itself largely due to all the heaviest casualties on the American side largely having had occurred within the first 3 to 4 years of the war. By then, it was at a point where over 100 million Americans had perished, with over 100 million more enslaved in laogais. Many of the latter also beheaded and organ harvested in one of the biggest genocides known to man. This left approximately, at least by that time, 140 million remaining Americans, whose numbers would slowly be ground down as the years dragged on, either via direct combat or as laogai liquidation numbers from extermination or even overwork. Albeit for now, the death rate on the Americans somewhat decreasing due to the hardening of those left remaining, alongside of their acquiring better weapons, strategy, and tactics, along with even groups better coordinating, and even most importantly of all, as it related to the final point, the liberated We to the Gers doing damage that the Americans could have never achieved all on their own. Eventually, Joseph bravely tried one big assault where he finally died in battle with his men, thereby leading them all one final time into a battle against the forces occupying his hometown of Butte. His aim was to steal vital weaponry and supplies and send a message that he wouldn't tolerate the enemy desecrating his hometown, which itself he'd always longed to return to anyways since the very beginning of the war. He'd shown this by his actions, and even his first recon and force operation at the very beginnings of his group had been directed at the enemy forces, thereby occupying Butte at that time. His plan and his aims were not at all illogical, as his intelligence reports ascertained from his scouting parties had informed him that only the headquarters battalion of the entire 75th National Militia Corps of China was currently present within the actual town of Butte itself, all alone to boot. However, other potent combat-oriented subunits of the 75th Corps were close by, encamped within various local additional garrisons, being comprised largely of different combat outposts in different areas, and even a few additional miniature FOBs, all encompassing Butte, but at a distance. Other real dangers close by were battalions of the PLA's 43rd Airborne Division, and the same very much applied insofar as perils were concerned to the 50th PAP Armored Division and the 53rd PLA Group Army. Despite this being the case, he knew the weakest link, proverbially speaking, of the huge group of different forces was the headquarters battalion over the whole 75th Corps of the CHICOM National Militia Paramilitary Forces. Montana was very special to the CHICOMs for both the sheer riches present in precious metals like platinum and palladium, this in addition to all the copper and silver for their massive electronics industries present back home in China. 127,000 total military and paramilitary troops, all combined, between all the forces deployed between years 2 and 4, now sat in Montana, or at least in the western portions of it. Hence, the reasoning for deploying so many forces was to wipe out the partisan threat from Montana as a whole. It should be said, though, that the way these forces were deployed was such that the airborne and national militia paramilitary troops were heavily centered on the mountains as lighter units. This, with the much heavier PAP 50th Armored Division and most of the PLA 53rd Group Army, being mostly on the hilly, more lower-laying lands of Montana in the east of the state. Even so, the heavier forces still had some of their subunits present within the mountain valleys of western Montana, and could be a big threat to any partisan attack on CHICOM bases. Joseph himself, meanwhile, figured that with a big enough force, that with the element of surprise coupled with proper sabotage and timing of the operation, that he could temporarily overwhelm the enemy forces of the headquarters battalion of the 75th National Militia Corps, and then steal their supplies and rapidly melt away upon so doing. It was the fourth year of occupation when he died in combat, trying to take on the Chinese National Militia 75th Corps headquarters troops occupying Butte with its still huge supply depot left there from the Trojan Shock Army days of the initial invasion. He timed his assault with sabotage initiated by several We to the Gers disguised as Chinese National Militia troops using uniforms and ID cards from previously deceased enemy personnel, as well as their knowledge of Mandarin and their facial features to sneak into the perimeter. These saboteurs would be cleared to proceed into town, where they'd proceed to place devastating charges on key enemy defensive positions and guard posts, including even managing to blast an enemy ammunition depot structure to pieces. Of the aforementioned, there were plenty of other depots in the same area which Joseph planned to raid to obtain vital weapon systems, ammo, food, and water. The others that were to be destroyed were simply because he couldn't carry everything and he had to deny the enemy the rest of their supplies. He faced now 4 battalions, 1 National Militia Corps anti-tank battalion, 2 truck infantry battalions, and of course the headquarters battalion over the entire 75th Corps itself. Nearby was elements of the 50th PAP Armored Division, some 5 battalions of which. Also, the PLA forces were spread out, with several of their battalions in Bozeman, along with PAP forces, and elsewhere well within striking range. It was a dangerous endeavor, to be certain. Joseph attacked with 1,500 men in total, but he was vastly outnumbered when it came to all local forces within the larger area as a whole. He thereby had to adjust his battle tactics accordingly. Yes, he quite possibly could have achieved the objective of raiding the supply depot there with the forces and equipment he actually had and possessed. However, it was the escape that would prove to be the main issue. The headquarters battalion over all of 75th Corps, now present within Butte, would end up fighting his men as they raced in towards the town, the partisans coming from the foothills and forests nearby. Fired everything from their 57mm air defense artillery cannons to anti-tank missiles and mortars and more, all mounted on different all-terrain vehicles and even stolen PLA vehicles, the latter being the primary platform used to carry the large 57mm cannons. These took the headquarters battalion in town by surprise and wiped out many of their men who stood guard at the time, all in tandem with charges placed in important security areas by the We to the Ger saboteurs. These troops, walking amid their defenses at the time, faced the detonating charges and faced mortars coming in. Albeit wildly inaccurate on the part of the mortars, they still served as an area saturation weapon, simply due to the sheer quantities taken from the previously ambushed Korean People's Army and some Chinese forces earlier on in the invasion, and the war as a whole. Also, the few 57mm guns his group did have by this point, including a few newer ones, replacing the older ones destroyed, served to impact the perimeter machine gun nests, blasting some of them totally out of the way, along with trucks and crew-serve machine guns mounted on the cabs of these National Militia paramilitary trucks. 57 millimeter shells ripped much of everything present into pieces, including the remains of homes still left on the outskirts, some of which having been turned into guard posts with fortifications built up around them. Also, anti-tank missiles were fired in large amounts that flew into multiple enemy positions and vehicles, now fired off of the backs of the ATVs, moving into position. Joseph and the ambushing troops had acted quickly, racing into the now battered headquarters area of Butte for the overall 75th National Militia Corps. Butte, itself adorned with its many Chi-Com propaganda posters and red flags of both the party and nation, was itself a major supply depot and logistical/maintenance station for the local forces. Their lieutenant general and his whole command staff were present within Butte. They called in their locally encamped subordinate forces of the 75th Corps to the town immediately, who were only a few miles away, these being their subordinate combat forces being ordered in to help the now besieged headquarters battalion. The Chinese troops of the headquarters battalion put up a vigorous fight as the partisans flew into the town upon their ATVs and stolen military vehicles, along with ample footmen attacking en masse and in tactical formations. Speed was the goal and built into the plan to raid the depot, which itself seen a few of its buildings erupting just a bit earlier from well-placed charges from the several saboteurs having had successfully snuck in. It was timed as an operation to last at maximum 1 hour. Get in, get out, break contact. Getting in close and fast protected them from air and artillery strikes due to friendly fire concerns. Getting out was to be done by scattering out in many multiple directions to minimize casualties from such strikes, with them clustering back upon having made it safely to the pre-designated collection points by the end of the mission. But in the meantime would run extremely spread out so that any munitions dropped or fired would do as minimal damage as possible. As the plan was being implemented, it went well until the partisans became bogged down, fighting inside the town, running into fortified buildings still standing used as barracks, and also a walled-off depot surrounded by HESCO walls and concertina wiring, with ample machine gun positions. As Joseph flew in on his VP scout vehicle with HJ-12 and Bullseye-2 anti-tank missiles on board, as well as an 82 millimeter mortar tube rigged up on the back itself, one of the men fired the mortar as they raced in, along with many others who did the same. Upon getting in, one of two men in back jumped off with a Bullseye-2 North Korean anti-tank missile, which he fired and hit a Chinese truck. Joseph jumped out and fired his Chinese-made HJ-12 into the Chi-Com barracks, which was an old 3-story store building in the small town's downtown area, now sandbagged and occupied by enemy soldiers. His missile had blasted into the sandbags, which blew out dust and gray smoke all over the place, with even some bricks as well from along the windows. He did some sort of damage, as he had pooled his AKM he still had since the beginning of the entire conflict, and then proceeded to fire at any enemy personnel he could see, along with many others doing the same as he was doing. This had become a quagmire now, as the men had tried improvisation with tactics adjusted for speed, which now was bogged down. Joseph yelled loudly as the fire raged to a man near him to jump on an ATV and tell the others to bring in the 57mm guns and hurry. Joseph needed big firepower to overwhelm the depot wall and its defenses, which already had seen the partial sabotage action occur within it. However, the we to the Gers had egressed the area, all according to the previous plan, just prior to the battle fully erupting, using the chaos of which starting to sneak out while the majority of the local Chi-Com forces were distracted by everything thereby unfolding. Even so, the firefight in town with the headquarters battalion now still raged on. Soon, too, the anti-tank battalion and 2 truck infantry battalions started to show up around the exterior of Butte and to outflank the partisans out there still fighting at the Chi-Com positions as they were found in Butte. As communications had been exceedingly difficult, the message got through from Joseph, but far too late. The group was now being harried by drone strikes and ground troops showing up in force to cut them off and, in their minds, destroy them. Even while this occurred, the men in the town fought their way to the depot, who were still inside of Butte fighting, but now unwittingly cut off and being surrounded. They began falling in large numbers. Joseph himself was unceremoniously gunned down by a machine gun nest guard post at the gate of the depot. Joseph's old home was by then a Chi-Com barracks full of CCP propaganda posters, although he wasn't fighting in that part of town, though others were doing so against the troops of the headquarters battalion of the 75th National Militia Corps of China. Had Joseph seen his home decorated in such a way, he would have been infuriated, needless to say. Partisans were now also fighting some of the other subordinate combat battalions belonging to the 75th as well, now just beginning to show up on the scene. Certainly, this large and fast partisan attack was completely unexpected on the part of the Chi-Coms, but it just wasn't enough still. Although it did eliminate many of the Chi-Com headquarters troops, who took everything from massed mortars, anti-tank missiles, and some 57mm and heavy machine guns mounted on ATVs and stolen enemy vehicles, respectively. Overall, the death toll in the short, swift battle was 260. National Militia Paramilitary Forces KIA'd, and 380 additional WIAs, out of mostly their headquarters forces of their headquarters battalion, who weren't even mostly combat troops, and were essentially more administrative and support forces by and large. Even so, they were armed and had basic combat training, although they suffered from not being specialized combat forces, unlike were their subordinate battalions beneath their command, which themselves came to the rescue from a close-by ad hoc FOB and several large combat outposts likewise nearby. The partisans lost nearly all their men, with a very scant few even managing to escape with their lives. Of course, these included the handful of we to the Gers who later went on to aid other groups throughout the duration of the occupation. Out of the 1,500 American attackers, 1,250 were KIA'd and 187 were captured, and the rest escaping the battle space before the encirclement of the town had completely closed in upon them. Hence did Joseph perish where he began, fighting in and essentially even for his own hometown. He was buried by the National Militia Chinese paramilitary troops, who actually honored their brave enemies by burying them in a mass grave just for them, even with a chiseled stone to signify their gravesite. All the Chinese deceased were, of course, themselves sent back to China, with the wounded in action medevaced by helicopter to a FOB with a military hospital present. Thus, by the fourth year, the war continued. Although her husband had fallen bravely in a desperate battle for Butte, thereby being his very last such battle, Salley, his wife, survived to the end of the long ongoing war, and thankfully in one piece. She initially had assisted her husband's own group, and then later, as time went on, she began learning vital medical skills, henceforth serving as a medical orderly for injured partisans of another group, upon her husband's group having had been virtually all wiped out. Doing so, as she felt taking care of the injured would be the very best way to honor the memory of her deceased husband. Despite Joseph and his partisan forces having been crushed, other groups, big to moderate to even small in size, continued the fight against the occupation. Some groups liberated we to the Gers from satellite Laogai camps further off from larger forces, allowing for them to utilize these men as added manpower. But most importantly of all, as vengeful saboteur forces who could, like in other areas throughout the land, be able to take the fight directly to the occupation forces, meaning where they lived within their installations. Their deadly missions caused massive devastation among the Chi-Com forces, as vital intel was also gathered along with the planting of many munitions in key areas, amid also even some assassinations. The grind would continue, and yet still more lives would continually be lost as the time elapsed. Bill Glass, of course, had fallen early on in the actual invasion phase itself on a mountain summit along the state line. Now, few of those who began the war had even made it this far, much less even survive the entire conflict as a whole. Of the conflict itself, it would last many grueling, devastating years of savagery never before seen, and devastation on an industrial, wholesale scale, thereby leaving the land completely moonscaped and wrecked in all manner of speaking. It also was to the point where the land almost became desolate even, as the war destroyed and colonial ambitions and workers strip-mined it, insofar as the land was concerned, of everything valuable that could even be taken within New China. By war's end, most of the American population would have either been exterminated or enslaved, all with very few survivors by the very ending of it all. Some 170 million having had been wiped out by that point, with another 130 million enslaved, and only some roughly 40 million left remaining spread out as primitive nomadic warrior tribes in the now desolated land. These figures manifesting all by the conflict's end. Surely not enough for a nation to be constituted as it once had been, nor really in any state to achieve any manner of any type of reconstruction, which would be virtually impossible with such a small population spread out among such a massive area. Chi-Coms had strip mined everything of value and pillaged the land and even people, leaving almost nothing left. After many years of harsh, brutal occupation, the likes of which words couldn't properly articulate, the Chinese decided they'd quit while ahead and leave in an orderly manner to appease their own population at home, who now grew sick of the long war, and thousands of family members having had return over the course of time to Chinese soil in CCP flag-draped coffins. All in all, the Chi-Coms lost tens of thousands, adding up to over 140,000 dead out of their over 29 million man, now even larger forces, due to raising up new group armies over the course of time. Deciding they would leave and quit while they were still ahead, and America had been for years exploited out of trillions of its resources and ample quantities of food collected, having been grown there, along with an obedient Canadian puppet regime upon which to send their forces pulling out, the evil CCP regime pulled their forces just across the border over to the rump lower Canadian puppet state of the CCP, adjacent also to the new Russian territories which lay just north of them. Seeing that the ample wheat and other commodities of rump Canada would still meet the food independence goals, they chose to do the orderly withdrawal, while still technically winning, as they'd made many trillions from the exploitation of their then former colony, while also destroying its people, and thus their hated mortal enemy, while also leaving nothing left to rebuild. Now China was still the top dog in the world and came out stronger with even larger military and paramilitary forces, scaring much of the world into compliance with their new world order of the CCP, who itself led the world into a despotic future of dark totalitarianism styled after itself as it related to the regime and foisted upon the world over. Russia, China's main ally, also came out of it all stronger and even chose to pull out of the war in the lower 48, which was to become China's territory after only 6 months, so as to not get embroiled in a long counterinsurgency that it felt it didn't need to, especially while it was on New China, not the new Russian lands, doing so. However, Russia, being known for its mastery of diplomacy, kept troops there as a gesture of goodwill and loyalty to their Chi-Com ally, for the short time they did. But little by little, as smaller nations paid their debts and left upon completion of such by deploying their troops, All of this left China then filling the void, but it was able to do so, and with brutal efficiency, eventually destroying all traces of America. And had their people not tired of the war, would have finished the extermination and slavery of every last one in merely 2 more years of war, as it was estimated. They were that close to it. Remember, to all listeners, this was a best case scenario for America within such a situation. If it's this bad as the best case scenario, then imagine a far worse case scenario where they never leave and finish everything. Despite, in the best case, they basically destroy and still ruin everything, leaving it all desolate and leave nothing left but a Flintstones-like desolate prehistoric land. Having taken everything of value and importance away and destroyed or enslaved nearly all the people, imagine then the worst case where there was a full-on economic, financial, food, and fuel collapse, then followed up by a civil conflict that severely weakened us, then coming the foreign invasion, which ends in total annihilation. This story was just a best case scenario for the American people and side in general throughout this ultra realistic story. And this story still has a horrible ending. If you, the listener, don't think this will happen, then think again. This is the end of the audio book and finale part 2 of 2. Thanks for listening.